Hello and welcome to our second to last day of social studies in 8th grade. We've only have one more lesson after this on Tuesday, and then we're done with social studies. So I hope you've had a good year, learned some interesting things, or, have a better picture of how the United States came to be the way it is. But today in our lesson, we are going to be wrapping up our learning and unit on Reconstruction, kind of seeing how the country was put back together after the Civil War. We've kind of seen so far how after the war, there were a lot of high hopes for creating more equality and justice for former slaves, now free African Americans in the United States, but it wasn't easy. There were people who believed in white supremacy, and like they still do in the world today, who believed that African Americans and other minorities should be kept down no matter what, that they should never be equal or be treated the same as white people. But there were people, and still are, who believe that everyone should be treated the same and that we are all equal and we should fight and stand up for that. But ultimately, what's going to happen at the end of Reconstruction is, as we saw in our lesson on Tuesday about the violence of the Klan, these forces of white supremacy and people that want to keep Black people down and other racial minorities, no matter what, do not want them to be considered just like everybody else. They are going to use violence to scare, intimidate, and just murder people using terror to enforce white supremacy. And unfortunately, this is going to have the effect, as we saw in our reading too, that a lot of people are going to kind of stop participating because of this terror and violence. A lot of people don't want to risk their lives by going out to vote if you're an African American. And unfortunately, this makes it so less African Americans are voting, and white Southerners are able to regain control of the governments of the South and pass new laws that really kind of restrict the freedoms of African Americans, make it so they can't vote. And this is the beginning of Jim Crow, like you saw in To Kill a Mockingbird, or all the other videos you've seen in Miss Will's class about how for the next 100 years after Reconstruction, African Americans are essentially going to still have no rights, not be treated with equality. And as we saw in one of our videos from PBS, it's going to essentially be slavery by another name. There's still no equality and justice, and Reconstruction ultimately fails. It's a failure for what people wanted. But the important part of history is remembering, well, why did it fail? And the stories that we tell ourselves are really important, because as we're going to see in today's lesson, there's oftentimes a negative or false view of Reconstruction that says that Reconstruction didn't fail because of the violence of the Klan and the power of white supremacy trying to keep Black people down. It's this racist view, actually, that, as we're going to see in the video, racists used to keep people down for another 100 years, was to say that Black people themselves couldn't be trusted, that when they were in control of these governments, it just crashed and burned. And it was Black people's fault themselves, that they didn't know how to take care of themselves in their own lives. And that's why they needed racist whites like the Ku Klux Klan to run things for them. And so today's lesson is going to be about memory and how we remember the past. But also our aim is going to be looking at and analyzing the connection between the failures of Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Because I'm sure people have heard of the Civil Rights Movement, people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, and maybe you heard of Malcolm X this year, hopefully, for me. But we are going to see that this continuing fight for equality and justice and civil rights really picks up 100 years later after Reconstruction. And we're going to read a speech from Martin Luther King, kind of looking at these connections. And so kind of seeing how even if Reconstruction failed and unfortunately freedom and equality were not achieved at that point, the fight continued on, and how also that fight continues on in the world today where we are. It's not like everything got solved in the 1960s, and there's still a lot to go. So we're going to kind of trace that path from the failures of Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, to where we are today, because these are all connections. And the reason that the world is the way it is today is because of what happened in the past. So we're going to analyze this. Make sure you see and watch all the videos and read the text carefully. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the second to last day of social studies. And of course, ask me if you have any questions as you do this assignment. And make sure you do the do now questions. And I'll see you in the next video after this one.